Judge Richard Caldwell had spent 15 years in the courtroom, presiding over cases of broken families and lost children. He believed he understood pain, that he had seen the worst of humanity. But everything changed the day an 8-year-old boy entered his courtroom holding a worn-out photograph. The boy's presence was unusual, his small frame, the weight of something unsaid in his expression. When Richard's eyes met his, something deep inside him shifted. There was something eerily familiar about those eyes, something that made his carefully structured world begin to crack. The case file before him was labeled in the matter of Elijah Carter, permanent placement hearing. As Richard flipped through the pages, his breath caught when he saw the mother's name, Naomi Carter. It was a name from his past, one he had buried long ago. Naomi, the woman he had loved, the woman his family told him had left and married someone else. His fingers tightened around the folder, scanning the timeline. The dates, the details, everything pointed to a truth he was not ready to face. Before he could fully process it, the boy spoke. His voice, though small, cut through the courtroom like a knife. "You abandoned me." The room fell silent. Every word struck Richard like a hammer. "You left me and Mom. You never came back." The words carried years of pain, the kind that no child should ever have to endure. Gasps filled the courtroom as whispers spread. Richard's mind raced. Naomi had waited for him. She had never moved on. The realization struck him with full force. His parents had lied. They had stolen not just a woman from him, but a child, a son he had never known. Richard tried to maintain control, but his hands trembled. He turned to his clerk, voice hoarse. "Call Judge Harrison. I need to recuse myself." The weight of his position, his authority, everything he had built, it all felt meaningless now. Because in front of him stood a boy who had lived 8 years, believing his father had abandoned him. He stepped down from the bench, his gaze never leaving the boy's. He had judged countless parents for their failures. Now the judgment had turned on him. The courtroom was filled with the usual air of formality, but today something felt different. Judge Richard Caldwell entered with his characteristic confidence, his black robe flowing behind him. His gavel hit the desk, signaling the start of another case, just another file in the long list of hearings he had presided over. Yet as his eyes swept across the room, they landed on a boy sitting in the front row, a child who could not have been older than 8. There was something about the boy's presence that sent a ripple of unease through Richard. The child sat stiffly, his small hands gripping something tightly, an old photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they were far too old for someone so young. Eyes that seemed to bore into Richard as if searching for something. Richard cleared his throat and shifted his focus to the file before him. Elijah Carter. Permanent placement hearing. The words blurred slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. His fingers tightened around the case file, his practiced judicial mask slipping for the first time in years. Then he saw it. His pulse pounded in his ears as his gaze landed on a name buried within the report. Mother's name, Naomi Carter. The words hit him like a physical blow. His mind raced back to years ago, to a time before he was a judge, before his world became consumed by justice and verdicts. Naomi. He had loved her once, more than anything. But she was gone, moved away, married someone else. That was what he had been told. His family had assured him she left. She moved on. She was not your concern anymore. But now, staring at the file in front of him, he realized something chilling. They had lied. His breath hitched as he flipped the pages, his hands shaking. His eyes darted to the birth records. Elijah Carter, born 8 years. A cold sensation spread through his chest. His gaze shot back up, meeting the boys once more, and then, as if sensing his realization, Elijah rose from his seat. His voice, small but razor-sharp, sliced through the silence of the courtroom. "You abandoned me," gasps rippled through the room. Murmurs erupted from the gathered spectators, but Richard heard none of it. He felt as though the walls were closing in, the room shrinking around him. The boy took a step forward, clutching the photograph in his tiny hands. His knuckles turned white. "You left us." Richard's world tilted violently. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could not breathe, could not think. He had a son, and he never knew. The truth struck him harder than any ruling, harder than any case he had ever presided over. This was his child, the child he had unknowingly abandoned, the child who had suffered while he sat in this very courtroom, passing judgment on other families. His knees threatened to buckle, his hands pressed against the desk, desperate to steady himself. I did not know," he finally whispered. Elijah's voice shook with emotion, years of pain spilling out in a single sentence. "Mom waited for you, even when she got sick. She said maybe you would come back, but you never did." Tears welled in the boy's eyes, but his gaze remained unwavering. Richard's stomach twisted violently. Sick? What did he mean? Naomi had been sick? His throat tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. Elijah, he could barely say the name. His son's name. The child flinched. His son, his flesh and blood. The reality was unbearable. He had spent the last 8 years believing lies, living in ignorance while Naomi had fought alone, while their son had suffered in foster care. The gavel felt like dead weight in his grip. His authority, his control, shattered in an instant. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. The social worker shifted uncomfortably. The clerk exchanged stunned glances with the attorneys. Richard forced himself to speak. His voice was hoarse, raw with disbelief. "Mr. Peterson," he said, turning to his clerk, his breath coming in. Shallow gasps. "Call Judge Harrison to take over this case." The clerk hesitated, confused. Richard gritted his teeth. Now! He could not do this. He could not be the judge in this case. Not when the case was his own flesh and blood. Elijah's small frame trembled, his fists clenched around the photograph. Richard finally saw it clearly now. It was a picture of him and Naomi, taken in a moment of happiness, a lifetime ago. His heart clenched painfully. He had thought he understood justice, thought he had seen broken families at their worst, but nothing had prepared him for the realization that he was the villain in this story. The courtroom faded into a blur. The walls felt suffocating. His son stood before him, looking at him with the weight of 8 years of abandonment. And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell had no verdict to deliver. Only guilt, only regret, only a desperate, overwhelming need to fix what had been broken. Richard sat alone in his chambers, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. His entire life had been built on lies, lies that had stolen his family. From him, lies that had kept him ignorant of the one thing that truly mattered. He had spent years passing judgment on others, deciding who was fit to be a parent, who was unworthy, never realizing that he had unknowingly abandoned his own child. The irony of it all crushed him. He stared at the photograph Elijah had held. In court, now sitting on his desk, the worn edges barely holding together after years of being carried like a lifeline. His son had clung to this image of him, this stranger, for years, believing in nothing but pain and broken promises. Naomi had kept Richard alive in their son's mind, even when she had every reason to let him go. She had died waiting for him, hoping he would find his way back to them, and he had failed. Memories he had long buried resurfaced with devastating clarity. Naomi with her infectious laughter, sitting under the old oak tree on their university campus, teasing him about his terrible taste in coffee, the way she would trace patterns on his wrist while they talked about their future, about the children they would have, about the home they would build together. Then came the night she left, the night his world had unraveled. He had fought with his parents about her, insisted that their love was real, that it was worth more than the legacy they were trying to force on him. But their power had been suffocating, their influence unshakable, and when they told him she had left, that she had moved on with someone else, he had believed them. It had been easier to believe she had abandoned him than to face the possibility that she had needed him, that she had been calling out for him all along. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He had been a coward. He had let his parents dictate his life, let them tear apart the only thing that had ever truly mattered. He had continued forward, building his career, securing his place in the world, all while his son had been shuffled through foster homes, alone and afraid. His fingers trembled as he picked up his phone. He found the number he never thought he would dial and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then his father's voice came through, calm and composed as ever. "Richard, I assume this is about the court hearing." Richard clenched his jaw. "You knew," he said, his voice low but trembling, with rage. "You knew about Naomi, about Elijah. You knew, and you let me believe they were gone." There was a pause. "We did what we thought was best. That girl—" "Do not call her that," Richard snapped, his voice shaking. "She was the love of my life. She was the mother of my son." His father sighed, as if this conversation were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You had a future, Richard, a legacy to uphold. If we had allowed you to throw it away for some fleeting romance—" "It was never fleeting," Richard roared. "It was real, and you took it from me. You took my family from me, and you let my son suffer because of it." His father was silent for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice colder than ever. "I will not apologize for protecting you. You are who you are today because of the choices we made for you." Richard laughed bitterly. "And who am I, father? A man who let his son rot in the foster system? A man who let the woman he loved die alone? A man who abandoned his own blood because he was too blind to see the truth?" His father exhaled, clearly frustrated. "This conversation is pointless. If you continue down this path, you will ruin everything you have built." "Then let it burn," Richard whispered. "I will not let you take anything else from me." He hung up. His whole body was trembling. The truth was clear now. His parents had never cared about his happiness, only control. They had stolen years from him, years that could never be reclaimed, but they would not take one more moment from him. Not now, not ever. His mind turned. Back to Elijah. His son had every right to hate him, every right to doubt him. He had spent his entire life being told that Richard did not care, that he was not wanted. How could he undo years of pain, of abandonment? How could he earn his son's trust when all Elijah had ever known was betrayal? He looked back down at the photograph. "I did not know," he whispered, as if Naomi could somehow hear him. "I did not know, but that does not excuse it. I will fix this, I swear it." For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell felt completely powerless. He could not command a courtroom into restoring what had been lost. He could not write a verdict that would make his son believe in him. All he could do was fight, and this time he would not lose. Richard stood outside the Maplewood Children's Home, his heart pounding in his chest. The imposing brick building, though well-maintained, felt cold and lifeless. This was where his son had been living. This was where Elijah had spent the last 4 years, alone, abandoned, not just by a broken system, but by the man who should have been there for him. Sarah Mitchell, Elijah's lawyer, stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "He agreed to meet you," she said, her voice firm but measured. "That is a big step, but do not expect too much." Richard exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "I do not expect anything, Sarah. I just need him to know that I am here." Inside, they were led to a small meeting room, bright yellow walls, cheerful paintings, an attempt to make it feel less sterile. But nothing could erase the underlying reality. It was a place for broken children, for abandoned souls. And then the door opened. Elijah stepped inside, his small frame tense, his fingers clutching the same worn photograph he had held in the courtroom. His eyes, Naomi's eyes, were guarded, wary, filled with the kind of pain no child should carry. He said nothing, just stood there, as if waiting for Richard to prove why he was even there. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to run to his son, to pull him into his arms, to apologize for every second of suffering. But he did not. He could not. Elijah was not ready for that. So instead, he did what he should have done years ago. He stayed. "Hello, Elijah." His voice was softer than he intended. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Elijah said nothing. He did not sit, did not acknowledge him. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Richard hesitated before carefully placing a small, wrapped package on the table. "I brought you something. You do not have to open it now or ever, but it is yours." Elijah's eyes flickered to the package for half a second, then back to Richard. He still did not speak. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. But Richard refused to fill it with empty words. He had spent too many years assuming, too many years believing lies. Now all he could do was listen, if Elijah ever chose to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elijah's voice broke through the silence. It was small, quiet, but sharp like a blade. "Why are you here?" Richard swallowed hard. He could hear the unspoken accusation beneath the question, "Why now? Why not before? Where were you when I needed you?" "Because I should have been here a long time ago," he admitted. "Because I failed you, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for it." Elijah's grip on the photograph tightened. His knuckles turned white. "You did not even look for us," he whispered. Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. "I thought—" He exhaled shakily, forcing himself to meet his son's eyes. "I thought your mother had moved on. My parents told me she had married someone else, that she left me behind. I believed them. That was my mistake. I should have fought harder. I should have found you both. But I did not, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." Elijah's jaw clenched. "Should have," he muttered bitterly. "Should have does not change anything." Richard nodded, accepting the truth in those words. "No, it does not, but I can change what happens next, if you let me." Elijah looked down at the package Richard had brought. He did not reach for it, did not acknowledge it. But he also did not push it away. Another long silence, then finally another question. "Why do you care now?" The words cut deeper than Richard had thought possible. "Because you are my son," he said simply. "And because I love you." Elijah's body went rigid. He stared at Richard like he had spoken something impossible, something foreign. "No, you do not." Richard's chest ached, but he did not argue. He could not expect Elijah to believe him yet. "I will prove it to you," he promised, "one day at a time, no matter how long it takes." Elijah's lip trembled, but he quickly looked away, shoving the photograph into his pocket as if it were his armor. The social worker entered then, signaling that their time was up. Richard stood reluctantly. "I will be back tomorrow," he said, "if that is okay with you." Elijah did not answer. He did not nod. He did not shake his head. He just stood there, silent and unreadable, but he did not say no, and for now that was enough. The next day, Richard returned to the Maplewood Children's Home. He had spent the entire night replaying every second of their conversation, trying to decipher every look, every silence. He knew he could not expect immediate change. He had been absent for 8 years. Trust was not something Elijah owed him. It was something he had to earn. Sarah met him at the entrance. He agreed to see. "You again?" she said, her voice neutral, but there was the faintest glimmer of surprise in her eyes. "That is more than I could have hoped for," Richard admitted. Inside the meeting room, Elijah was already waiting, sitting stiffly in the same chair as yesterday. The package Richard had left behind was untouched on the table in front of him. It was a small thing, but the fact that it was still there meant something. Richard took his seat slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hello again," he said, keeping his tone light. Elijah did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up the package, turning it over in his hands. "What is in this?" Richard's breath caught, but he kept his voice steady. "It is a picture. Frame." He hesitated before continuing. "I had your photograph restored, the one of your mother and me. The original is still yours, of course, but I thought you might want a new copy, something to keep safe."